DiscerningHearts.com presents The Doctors of the Church, The Charism of Wisdom, with Dr. Matthew Bunson. For over 20 years, Dr. Bunson has been active in the area of Catholic social communications and education, including writing, editing, and teaching on a variety of topics related to church history, the papacy, the saints, and Catholic culture. He is the faculty chair at the Catholic Distance University, a senior fellow of the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and the author or co-author of over 50 books, including the Encyclopedia of Catholic History and the best-selling biographies of St. Damien of Molokai and St. Kateri Tekakwitha. He also serves as a senior editor for the National Catholic Register and is a senior contributor to EWTN News. The Doctors of the Church, The Charism of Wisdom, with Dr. Matthew Bunson. I'm your host, Chris McGregor. Welcome, Dr. Bunson.
Wonderful to be with you again, Chris.
Thank you so much for joining us to talk about this particular doctor of the Church, who it's rare, isn't it, in our lifetimes to have those saints elevated to the status of doctor who have quite a background, like Saint Hildegard Bingen.
Yes, well, she is, of course, with John of Avila, one of the two of the newest doctors of the Church, proclaimed as such by Pope Benedict XVI, who has, I think, a special fondness for her. And as we get to know her, we certainly can understand why he holds her in such great repute and such great respect. It's easy to overlook the fact that in her lifetime, she was called the Sibyl of the Rhine, and throughout the whole of the 12th century in which she lived, she was renowned for her visions, but she was especially loved and respected for her wisdom, the greatest minds of her age, and of course was renowned also for her great holiness. So this is a formidable figure in the medieval church, and somebody I think that we really need to look at today as we proceed with the reform and renewal of the church.
I'll try to put this very sensitively when I say that her presence in our times is one that unfortunately was relegated maybe into a back corner by many because of those who try to hijack in some ways her spirituality to try to move forward certain agendas.
Yes, I think that's a very diplomatic way of putting it. Hildegard in the last 10 years or so, and Pope Benedict XVI, I think, helped lead the charge in this, has been reclaimed by the Church. Her authentic writings, her authentic spirituality, and especially her love for the Church and her obedience to the authority of the Church have all been recaptured, reclaimed for the benefit of the entire Church. It's absolutely true that over the previous decades, much as we saw with a few others, I'm thinking, for example, of Julian of Norwich in England, who lived a little after Hildegard, were sort of kidnapped by those with real agendas to try to portray Hildegard as a proto-radical feminist, as somebody who was hating of the Church, who attempted to resist the teachings of the Church, who rejected the teachings of the Church. And yet, as we read her, as we come to appreciate her more fully, I think we can grasp her extraordinary gifts, but also her remarkable love for the Church.
She was one who allowed herself to be subjected to obedience. That wonderful, can we say it, a virtue as well as a discipline?
Absolutely, yeah. It's one of those ironies, again, to use that word, that here was somebody who was falsely claimed by feminists, who I think would have been just shocked at the notion of herself as a feminist, that she had instead a genuine love for the Church, a profound mysticism. And you've hit on one of the key words that we're going to be talking about with her, and that is the perfection of the virtues, a love for Christ, and her obedience to the Church, to the authority of the Church in judging what is authentic and what is pure. And that, I think, holds her up as a great role model today when we have so many who are dissenting from the church and continue to cling to this notion of Hildegard as some sort of a herald of feminism in the church.
I don't think I would understate it by saying that it was breathtaking in the fall of 2010 when then Holy Father Pope Benedict XVI began a series of Wednesday audiences on the holy women of the Middle Ages. And he began those reflections, especially on those who had such deep mystical prayer experiences. He began the audiences not with just one, but two audiences on Hildegard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he has made it very clear. He certainly did this as Pope. He's done this throughout his life as a theologian. Somebody who wants to make certain that the Church recognizes and honors genius in all of its forms, but also profound holiness. And Pope Benedict, in that the set of audiences, especially regarding Hildegard, but I mean, when we run through the list of some of the great figures that he was looking at, he talked, for example, about Julian of Norwich. He covered Catherine of Siena, Bridget of Sweden, Elizabeth of Hungary, and of course Angela of Foligno, who just recently was canonized through equivalent canonization by Pope Francis. The gifts to the Church, the contributions to the life of the Church, to the holiness of the Church by these remarkable women, it's something that we need to pause, and I really appreciate the fact that you want to do that, to credit Pope Benedict for doing that, but also to turn our gaze to these extraordinary women. And it is significant that Hildegard of Bingen was included in that list.
If you could, give us a sense of her time period.
Well, she grew up in Germany and really was a member of the German nobility. And she belonged to the German feudal system. In other words, her father was a wealthy, powerful landowner at a time when owning land was everything. His name was Hildebert, and his wife, Matilda, or Mechtilda, were both in the service of, as the feudal system worked, a more powerful lord by the name of Megenhard, who is Count of Spanheim. Now, these are sort of dazzling names to people today. But what's really most important is that medieval feudal life in Germany was one of service, it was one of status, but this reflects on the upbringing of Hildegard, I think, in a couple of ways. First, because she was born into this noble environment, she had the opportunity to learn, to understand what it was to command, to know what it was to have special status, and yet, from her earliest times, she displayed extraordinary intelligence, but also very powerful spiritual gifts and a desire for humility. Now, her parents were very much status conscious, as so many of the members of the feudal nobility were, and yet they recognized in their daughter the fact that she was called to something else other than sort of the life of service and of status that they enjoyed. And for that reason, they offered her up, as was the custom of the time, as sort of a tithe to the church, as an oblat to the nearby Benedictine abbey of Dissebodenberg. And she was only 8 years old at the time, but that was the custom. And her life changed from that minute. But it was, I think, the greatest gift that her parents could have given her, because they placed her in exactly the environment that she needed the most to really foster, to develop her spiritual life. And all of the skills that she was given by God that she came to possess as an abbess and as a leading figure of the medieval church.
The stability of the Benedictine rule, that way of devoting time in your day, not only to work, the discipline of action, but then also to prayer, it really served her so well, didn't it?
It did. And especially crucial in this was the fact that, as was, again, that the wisdom of the Benedictines, they gave her over for her initial training to other women who were experienced in life, in the spiritual life, in the discipline of the Benedictine community, but also in the spiritual life that they saw, I think, immediately needed to be developed in her. There was the first by a widow by the name of Uda, and then more important was another woman by the name of Jutta of Spanheim, who was the daughter of Count Stefan of Spanheim. Now, why is it that notable? It's notable because in Jutta, not only did Hildegard receive a kind of spiritual mother, as well as a spiritual guide and mentor, but Jutta was, being the daughter of the nobility, clearly aware of Hildegard's background as well as her immense potential in dealing with other members of the nobility in future years. The position of abbess was one of great power. We don't encounter abbesses and abbots very much anymore. And yet, because of the status of the Benedictine order, because of the lands that it accumulated, but also because of its importance to the life of the community wherever you had a Benedictine monastery, abbots and abbesses acquired and wielded great influence in society and political life, economic life, and then, of course, their spiritual power. And Jutta would have understood all of this. And over the next decades, she helped train Hildegard in a life of prayer, of asceticism, but also of training the mind and the personality to command, to lead with charity, and then, of course, to have the level of learning that was the best they could give her to prepare her for the immense tasks that lay ahead.
Let's talk about some of those tasks. It's an incredible time for monastery life, and it would be affected by her example of how it could be transformed.
Yeah. Well, Hildegard always seriously underestimated and sort of downplayed her own learning. She referred to herself as an indocte mulier, or an unlearned woman. And yet, while she may have had sort of formal academic training that one might think of today, she nevertheless understood Latin, certainly the use of the Psalter. The Latin language, of course, was the language of the church. It was so much of the common language of ecclesiastical life. But she also continued to develop in her understanding of people, of prayer life, and in dealing with and helping to train other noble women who were sent to this community. And so when she was given, as they say, she took the veil from the Bishop of Bamberg when she was about 15 years old. From that point on, we can see a direct line of progress and advancement for Hildegard. This wasn't something that she was craving, but it was something I think that she took to quite naturally, both because of her training, both because of her family background, but also just because of her genius level IQ. I say genius level IQ because if you spend much time reading the works of Hildegard, the unbelievable diversity of which she was capable, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, you appreciate the sheer level of her intelligence and how in that community life, in the wisdom of the Benedictine life, they were able to recognize that, to harness it, to train it, and then put it to the good of the community and the good of the wider church, not just for the church's benefit, but to make of Hildegard's immense gifts exactly that, a gift to the church, a gift to the community, but especially a gift to God. And so we're seeing her move rapidly from a humble young girl, somebody who was then trained to become a teacher or a prioress of the sisters. And then, of course, around the age of 38, she became the actual head of the community of women at Disse-Bodenberg.
I think it's so important to honor that intellectual aspect of Hildegard. I mean, the fact that she would have this ability like a sponge to absorb everything around her. And so it seems, and also to wed that with her spiritual life and those mystical experiences. And when she had, how can we say this? It was very unique in that it wasn't that she would have a vision of something. She would even say she doesn't see things ocularly. I mean, something that she would have in front of her. No, it was something much more compelling in which it incorporated all of her. I mean, not only the spiritual aspect, but it brought in to play all that intellectual knowledge so that you would end up getting tomes and tomes and tomes of writing.
Yes, that's exactly it. For her, while she was certainly conscious of her limited education, she understood that the knowledge that she possessed came from what she always referred to in the Latin as the umbra viventis luminis, or the shadow of the living light. And for her, this is not something that she was too eager or all that willing to write about, which is, as you certainly know, Chris, of all people, that's one of the great signs of the genuineness of the spiritual gifts, that she was reluctant to talk about this extraordinary series of visions and mystical experiences that she began having as a young girl, but chose not to speak of until she actually began to share them with Jutta, then with her spiritual director, who was a monk by the name of Volmar, who really I think was a good influence on her. And only when she was really in her 40s did she begin to describe and to transcribe so much of what she saw. And part of that, I think, was because here was somebody who was receiving these visions, these mystical experiences from a very young age, but who wanted to ruminate on them, who wanted to meditate on them. And for her, then, it was the command to talk about these. And as she wrote in the Shivyas, one of her greatest of her writings, she talks about the fiery light coming out of a cloudless sky that flooded her entire mind and inflamed, she said, her whole heart and her whole breast like a flame. And she understood at that moment the exposition of the books, of the Psalter, the Gospel, the Old and the New Testaments, and it was by command that she made these visions known. But it was, again, out of humility, out of obedience to the voice that she did this. And the full scale of what she saw and then what she began to teach, to transcribe, took up almost the whole of the rest of her life. And yet, even at that moment, as she did so, what was she doing? She sought additional counsel in the discernment of the authenticity and the origins of her visions of the truth of what she was seeing. Why? Because she was concerned that they might not be of God, or that they were mere illusions or even possible delusions brought on by herself or by the evil one. And that commitment to obedience, I think, stands her in such great standing in the history of the Church among the mystics. But it also tells us that, as is often has been the case with some of the mystics in history, there have been those positivists and scientists and psychologists who try to dismiss these mystical experiences. In Hildegard's case, what have they claimed? They have said that she was receiving these simply psychological aberrations, or they were various forms of neurological problems leading up to migraines or a host of other possible issues. And yet, the clarity of her visions, the specificity of them, and also the theological depth of them demolish any such claims by scientists today, and instead really force us to look at what exactly she was seeing.
I don't doubt that there will be many out there over the next century, particularly, that could achieve their doctorates just by writing on different aspects of her work. And if you are at all a student of the Benedictine rule, you can begin to see in those visions those connections with the life that she lived out. I mean, this was very organic. It wasn't like this were just coming, though they seem foreign to us when you begin to look at those visions. If you understand the time, if you have a proper translation and you know the rule, you begin to see a little bit better the clarity of what she's communicating.
Yes, exactly. And we also appreciate the staggering scale of what she saw. I mean, she saw the mystery of God. She saw creation, the Trinity, incarnation, the fall, redemption. She beheld as well the sacraments. She understood the virtues. She appreciated angels. She saw vice. She saw, as Pope Benedict XVI talked when he in his letter proclaiming her a doctor of the Church. What did he say? He said that the range of vision of the mystic of Bingen was not limited to treating individual matters, but was a global synthesis of the Christian faith. So he talks about that this is a compendium of salvation history, literally from the beginning of the universe until the very eschatological consummation of all of creation. So as he says, God's decision to bring about the work of creation is the first stage on a long journey that unfolds from the constitution of the heavenly hierarchy until it reaches the fall of the rebellious angels and the sin of our first parents. So she's touching on the very core of who we are and the most important aspects of redemption, of the kingdom of God, and the last judgment. The scale of this, again, I think is difficult for much of the modern mind to comprehend. And it tells us that we have to be very careful from our perch here and surrounded by technology and modernity, that we perhaps have lost our ability to see the sheer scale of salvation history, that this abbess sitting on the Rhine in the 12th century was able to, and then was able to communicate it with language that is surprisingly modern.
Oh, let's talk about that language, not only with words, but with music and with art. I mean, this woman was able to express herself in all manners of creative activity.
Yes. I mean, this is somebody that created her own kind of language. It's sort of a combination of Latin and German, which is a medieval German. But she also composed hymns, more than 70 hymns. She composed sequences and antiphons, what became known as the Symphonia Harmoniae Celestium Revelationem, or the Symphony of the Harmony of Heavenly Revelations. And not only were they simply composed because, well, her community would need music, they were very much a reflection of the things that she had seen. And she wrote a very memorable letter in 1178 to the prelates of the city of Mainz. And she talks about the fact that music stirs our hearts and engages our souls in ways we can't really describe. But we're taken beyond our earthly banishment back to the divine melody Adam knew when he sang with the angels when he was whole in God before his exile. So here she's once again taking something as seemingly simple as a hymn and connecting it to the vision, connecting it to salvation history, and connecting to something far deeper theologically. So her hymns ranged from the creation to the Holy Spirit, but she was especially fond of composing music in honor of the saints, and especially the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Yeah, as we're coming to a conclusion on this particular episode, I don't want to miss out on just a little bit of a tidbit. We could have called her a doctor. I mean, in a very real way, a physician. This woman, this wonderful gift to the church, gift to all of us. I mean, she had that appreciation of creation and actually even on how it would work to heal.
Yes. Again, it's hard to overestimate her genius. Why? Because beyond her visions, beyond her abilities as a composer, here was somebody who combined her genius with practical need. Her community had specific needs for her gifts. And so what did she do? She wrote books on the natural sciences. She wrote books on medicine. She wrote books on music. She looked at the study of nature to assist her sisters. So the result was a natural history, a book on causes and cures, a book on how to put medicine together. And it's this fascinating reading because she talks about plants and the elements and trees and birds and mammals and reptiles. But all of it was to reduce all of this knowledge to very practical purposes, the medicinal values of natural phenomena. And then she also wrote in a book on causes and cures, which is written from the traditional medieval understanding of the humors. She lists 200 diseases or conditions with different cures and remedies that tend mostly to be herbal, with sort of recipes for how to make them. This is all from somebody who at that time was an abbess of not just one, but two monasteries along the Rhine, who was also being consulted on an almost daily basis by the great figures of the church, from popes to kings to common people who came to her for help. And this is somebody who at that time was also working for her own perfection in the spiritual life and in the perfection of the virtues, and who was also continuing to reflect and meditate on the incredible vision she was receiving. So this was a full life, but it was a life given completely to the service of others.
And of course, you'll have to have 2 episodes.
We do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bunson.
Looking forward to part 2, Chris.
You've been listening to The Doctors of the Church, The Charism of Wisdom with Dr. Matthew Bunson. To hear and or to download this program along with hundreds of other spiritual formation programs, visit discerninghearts.com. This has been a production of Discerning Hearts. I'm your host, Chris McGregor. We hope that if this has been helpful for you, that you will first pray for our mission, and if you feel it's worthy, consider a charitable donation, which is fully tax-deductible, to support our efforts. But most of all, we pray that you will tell a friend about discerninghearts.com and join us next time for The Doctors of the Church, The Charism of Wisdom with Dr. Matthew Bunson.